Good evening, everyone. Today's video is going to be looking at the last bullet point of... That's a fantastic start, Kieran. Well done. We're going to be looking at the last bullet point of relationships, and that is parasocial relationships. So there's only 5 bullet points to relationships, unlike the usual 6. Parasocial relationships is going to be looked at. Knowing what they are, you need to know the levels of parasocial relationship, and then 2 theories about why they happen: the Absorption-Addiction Model, as well as the attachment theory explanation. Now, I would say when these slides were made, I had in mind that you were late second years, or mid second years, and actually by this point you should be doing your own research. So this isn't everything you need to know. This is the basics and maybe a little bit more. You certainly probably should know these theories in this bullet point to a greater level than the screencast you're currently watching actually suggests. So, parasocial relationships, right? I hadn't heard of parasocial relationships. I'd never done parasocial relationships at uni or at college. But it's essentially dealing with people who believe they're in a relationship with someone who is not aware they exist. So stalkers are a form of parasocial relationship in many ways, but what we're mainly looking at is how people actually enter a parasocial relationship with a celebrity, i.e. someone who has no idea they exist. With stalking, generally speaking, the victim knows, but with celebrity worship or celebrity stalking, that's not always the case. So there's a massive storm going on outside and I keep getting flashes. So parasocial relationships, as I've said, is when an individual generally believes they're in a relationship with someone else, which is usually a celebrity. It's also known as hero worship, and it tends to come from people who are in the media spotlight. Sports is a big one, TV and film. If you can think of anyone famous, chances are they have had a stalker of some kind. And one thing I will be doing with my classes is I will be finding out who you were in a parasocial relationship with. Now, please don't misunderstand me. Most, if not all of you, are in a parasocial or have been in a parasocial relationship before. It's just been a low-level parasocial relationship, which is relatively healthy. What we will also be talking about is people whose parasocial relationships have gotten very intense, very creepy, and all round not very nice. So, typically, and this is probably quite important actually, typically parasocial relationships will occur between the ages of 11 and 17. So over the last couple of years, you have been, very, very close to certain celebrities, and some of you are a little bit obsessive. I have had many students in my teaching career who were initially obsessed with One Direction. Oh my God, that was a massive lightning. Okay, don't get scared. They were initially obsessed with... that was a massive lightning. That doesn't make any sense. So they were initially obsessed with One Direction, and now they are absolutely obsessed with Harry Styles. Absolutely obsessed with Harry Styles, to the point where you think, we're probably approaching something that's not healthy. Now, actually, one thing you probably do need to know is that normal parasocial relationships between this age are actually very good for creating an identity. When you are that age, the age you are, you don't really know what your impact on society is. You don't really know who you are in society. You don't really know which direction you're going, and actually identifying with someone can actually help resolve that identity crisis that you have when you're going through adolescence. And it's worth noting down, by the way, is that there is a healthy side to parasocial relationships. These people act as models for us and tell us how to act. They teach us how to be in certain situations. They help that reinforce this idea of, oh, it's okay to be me, for example, because, Harry from One Direction is like this as well. So at a low level, parasocial relationships are quite important, but there is actually, when parasocial relationships get very unhealthy, there is actually a correlation, a negative correlation between the strength of a parasocial relationship and the low level of education. There is a negative correlation between that. And I'm not saying that everyone who is obsessive about Harry Styles is not a clever person. I'm not saying that. Psychology is. So there is a bit of a gender difference here, or a sex difference, I should say, is males prefer sports stars, generally speaking. My hero growing up was Alan Shearer. I identified with him. I would pretend to be him on the football field, social learning theory, whereas females prefer entertainment personalities, apparently. Do with that what you will. There are a couple of pieces of research here, but this isn't... You're unlikely going to get a question specifically on parasocial relationships. Maybe I'm wrong, maybe I've misinterpreted the spec here, and yes, this is probably useful to know, but you're unlikely. Where I think you're going to get most questions is on things like levels of parasocial relationships and the two theories. So let's go into this in a bit more detail. So there are 3 levels to a parasocial relationship. We don't really need to deal with that. Giles and Maltby 2006 created what's called the CAS, the Celebrity Attitude Scale, and it measures these 3 subscales basically, and you need to know what these 3 subscales are. So all of us would score highly on the first subscale, the entertainment social subscale. I've got a little bit more detail for this in a second, but the very basics, it measures items like just purely how much you talk about media personalities. Now, that's not harmful. Another of the subscales is the intense personal subscale. Now, whilst you will probably score highly on this one, you definitely do not want to score highly on this one. Measures strengths of feelings and levels of obsessions about media personalities. So it's a little bit more psychotic, it's a little bit more unhealthy. The one you really don't want to score highly on is the borderline pathological subscale, which measures levels of uncontrollable feelings and behavior about media personalities. Now, most of us would score highly on this and then low on these 2 just here. If you had a genuinely bad parasocial relationship, you would score highly on all of them. Now, as it says down here, thought parasocial relationships are on a dimension. Lower scorers tend to be just interested in their celebrity, for example, but high scorers become more obsessive, dangerous, and these are the ones that end up getting arrested for stalking Taylor Swift. These are the ones who get arrested in Justin Bieber's bed, for example, having broken into his house. These are the ones who killed John Lennon. So anyway, let's go into a little bit more detail about all of these, right? So entertainment social subscale is the one that you're probably going to score highly on. In this, if you score highly on this, celebrities are seen as a source of entertainment, as a topic for light-hearted gossips. This is the least intense level, and it's where the majority of people spend their time talking about celebrities. So, for example, in my office, I have many strange things, which I'll go on to that later, actually. But in my office, I have these just here. These are the 3 vinyls of a band, arguably my favourite band, the XX. I love the XX. I listen to them every day. If people talk to me about the XX, I will engage in enthusiastic conversation. But do I think about them every day? No. Do I know where they live? No. How many times have I seen them? I've seen them once in Brixton. It was amazing. That's not the point. But I have a healthy parasocial relationship with them. I have a healthy. I would score highly on the entertainment subscale, but I wouldn't score highly on the intense personal subscale. So at this level, a person has a more intense relationship. They may see them as their soulmate. That doesn't apply to me with the XX. Does it apply to you with Harry? They have an intense interest in the celebrity's personal life, such as they copy their dress sense, the food they like, they know where they live, for example. They know all the tour dates, so on and so forth. They've got hundreds of thousands of pounds of memorabilia on there. And it's this type of parasocial relationship, which it is actually quite the start of something that's a little bit worrying. So the real worrying one is the borderline pathological subscale. All three of these men have been convicted, apparently, of being Taylor Swift's stalker. One of these may have climbed into her New York apartment. I remember reading that. But this is the most intense one. At this level, they take it to the extreme. They have obsessive fantasies where, by the way, they are completely delusional. I think someone turned up at Miley Cyrus's house claiming that he was her husband, and not only claiming he was her husband, but genuinely believing that he was her husband, and that none of her security staff knew, none of her friends or family at the house or the compound knew. And he was like, oh yeah, we're married, but you just don't know about it. And he genuinely believed that. So that kind of is essentially mental illness, really. They have large memorabilia, they engage in illegal activity, and like I say, has often, in many cases, actually led to them killing the object of their desire, like John Lennon, like Selena. There's quite a lot actually. Now, in terms of research, Malloy, and to be honest, this could go into one that we see later on, but Malloy found that stalkers tend to have a history of that storm is getting quite loud, failed sexual relationships, and they tend not to be in a relationship at the time of stalking, and it tends to be a response to both social and sexual incompetence. Now, what I want you to pay attention to is we're going to refer back to this later on. You can use Malloy for the levels of parasocial relationship, but Malloy would be a better piece of research for the Absorption-Addiction Model, which is what we're literally about to get onto. So keep that in mind. Basically, stalkers are not good socially and they're not good sexually, so they have failed. They have no success, for example. They don't feel like they're a success, they feel like they're a failure. They have low levels of education. It's quite important in a second. And Maltby found that actually people in the entertainment social category were actually mentally healthy, which obviously makes sense because most teenagers go through that. All of us, by the way, your whole lives could be argued to be in the entertainment social category. If I go back, they don't look like teenagers to me. So essentially, this is not just a thing a teenager goes through. Some people kind of stay in there a little bit longer, I think it's fair to say. By the way, if you are one of these people, please don't stalk me for slagging you off. Okay, now, a bit of an evaluation there on an unfinished slide, very unprofessional. Now let's go into a little bit more detail. This is the first theory we're looking at. So what we've looked at so far is just purely the different levels you can get. This is the theory as to why it happens. So it's an explanation. As you can see here, there is someone who's very obsessed with MJ, Michael Jackson. The Absorption-Addiction Model is a pretty basic model. There's basically two steps. You absorb their success and you become addicted to it. That's literally it. So the first one is you are an individual. So absorption is the first part. You're an individual who, let's just say, is not particularly successful in life. You don't have great education. You are not successful with the same or the opposite sex. You have never, had a long-term successful trusting relationship. Essentially, you feel like maybe you're a bit of a loser, maybe. And that actually getting close to a celebrity and absorbing their success is actually quite nice. It makes you feel like you're a winner, for example. If everyone's, you get really, really close to the celebrity. If you hear other people talking about them, it's almost like they're talking about you, for example. And that's the absorption bit. You basically take the success of somebody else and you put it in your life where you haven't had that much success. And the basic premise of all psychology is if you do anything that ends in a reward, you're more likely going to continue doing it. It's the law of effect, operant conditioning, for example. If you take this absorption and you get a lot of pleasure, you get a lot of satisfaction and contentedness, then you may become addicted to that. And so the idea is you absorb their success, but that can become quite addictive. And it's at this stage when it becomes addictive and it's quite hard to turn away from that actually criminal behavior does tend to take place. Stalkers are notoriously difficult to stop stalking. Right, you can't just go, right, you're in prison, because as soon as they get out, if they still have those untreated feelings and desires, etc., then they're going to go back to stalking again. So it's almost like stalking is an addiction, and addictions are notoriously difficult to fix. So this is essentially the basic premise of why parasocial relationships happens. This is the first theory that you need to know. Greenwood and Long found a link between loneliness and parasocial relationship, which supports the absorption-addiction model. And they found evidence that people may develop celebrity worships as a way of dealing with recent loss or loneliness. That was countered, but it's also, I would argue, potentially quite sensitive to say, oh, you're in a parasocial relationship. That must mean you're a loser. So if you know that you are in this type of relationship, you're probably going to be concerned. You're probably going to be quite offended. You're probably going to be, it's not going to be nice to find that out. So you could argue that it is. However, on the flip side, there's massive practical implications from this. If we know that unsuccessful people actually get into parasocial relationships, a therapist can sit down with their sufferer, if you will, and try to make them successful. Maybe using Maslow's hierarchy of needs, for example. However, all we've really got here is a correlation. All we've got here is a correlation between level of education and parasocial relationship prevalence. It's not saying one causes the other. It's just a relationship. Big issue. Now, for this next thing, by the way, this next theory, you kind of do have to recap attachment, the types of attachment, particularly when it comes to Ainsworth and her 3 types. The reason being is this theory says that no, it's not absorption or addiction, right? What a load of BS. What it is faulty attachments, namely resistant attachments, insecure resistant. So those with an insecure resistant attachment type are more likely going to enter a parasocial relationship. To do this, you may have to go back and recap insecure resistant, but at its basic, it is people who have inconsistent care. So sometimes they were nurtured really well, sometimes they were treated quite cold, and that leads to clingy, attention-seeking behavior. Does that sound familiar to any of you? Clingy, attention-seeking behavior of people who are intense, very intense in their emotions that they feel, and they tend to fall in love very quickly. If they had an argument, I don't know if you saw that, but that was quite close. That was bare lightning. If they have that was very bright. If they have an argument with someone, they will hold it over your head. That's only about 4 miles away. So that's the basics of insecure resistant. So, and look, people who are insecure resistant hate the idea of being left alone. They hate the idea of abandonment. I mean, I'm avoidant and I don't love the idea of abandonment, but they hate it. They fear being broken up with. They worry about being left alone in this world. So why not get with someone who doesn't know they're in a relationship with you? Because if they don't know they're in a relationship, they can't break up with you. Smart. That is smart. So parasocial relationships are seen as ideal for people because people who are resistant, unless they get with someone who is resistant, their relationships don't tend to last that long. So parasocial relationships are ideal sheltered relationship because they can have that close emotional connection to someone even if the other person isn't aware of it, but they cannot be broken up with. So it's an ideal place for people who have insecure resistant attachments. And yeah, that's the very basics. Now, obviously, Hazan and Shaver says there's a link between you being resistant as a kid and then you growing up and being resistant as an adult. So it says here that resistant children will translate into clingy or jealous behavior in adulthood. Do you know anyone who is clingy and overly jealous more so than the average teenager? Because the average teenager is actually quite jealous, by the way. But more than the average. Do you know someone who's almost aggressively jealous? Chances are that person has a resistant attachment. Chances are that person is likely going to have a parasocial relationship, particularly if they don't have any education as well. So that is the basics, really. So Kienlin, and again, some really good pieces of research here, right? They're basically saying, do we find that resistant kids tend to be stalkers? 63% of stalkers experience an early loss of a primary caregiver, which usually results in resistant attachments. While more than 50% reported physical, mental, or sexual abuse as a child. If you have a disrupted attachment, it clearly has a strong influence over whether or not you are going to be a stalker. Colin Leit's pretty basic piece of research, but adolescents with insecure resistant attachments were more likely going to have a parasocial relationship than secure or avoidant. So both of these back up this idea about attachment being a big, big role. I would argue the attachment theory is better. That was a bit Shirley, wasn't it? It was a bit common. I'm from Shirley, so I can say that. Don't complain. So what was I saying? Oh my God, this storm has really sent me weird. Anyway, let's move on. And that's pretty much it. So in terms of questions, you're going to get anything from between 1 markers to 16 markers. But what I would want for this one just here, by the way, outline and evaluate psychology's concept of parasocial relationships. 16 marks. In that case, I would talk about levels of explanation, absorption-addiction model, and the attachment theory. And for those 3 things, I would want to know 8 separate things for your AO1, followed by 3 strong peels. That is it for parasocial relationships and relationships in general. If you're a second year watching this for the first time, then chances are we're going to be moving on to addiction quite soon. That was quite close. I'm just going to go and hide under the covers. Peace out.